There are men who measure a man by what he owns, and there are men who measure a man by what he does when no one is watching. Eli Beiler had spent 52 years learning the difference, and he would have told you if you asked that he had it figured out. He would have said it plainly, the way he said most things, without decoration or apology. He would have meant it. Most men who are wrong about something mean it just as sincerely as the men who are right, and that is the part that makes it complicated. It was the second week of May when he first started watching Jonas Yoder the way a man watches something he hasn't named yet. The morning had come in cool and clean off the fields, the kind of May morning that makes a Lancaster County farmer feel, briefly, that the year might go well. The apple trees along the lane were done blooming and beginning to leaf out in earnest, and the soil in the south field had dried to just the right consistency after 3 days without rain. Eli had walked out after the morning milking with his coffee, going cold in his hand, and stood at the edge of the field and felt something close to gratitude, which was a feeling he had been practicing at getting back since Ruth died. Jonas was already in the field. He had hitched Pepper to the corn planter before Eli had finished at the barn, and now he was moving down the long south rows at the patient, steady pace the gray gelding preferred. Pepper was not a young horse. He was broad-chested and a little round in the barrel, and he had a way of planting each foot as though he had thought about it first. Jonas had acquired him 3 years ago from an auction in Mifflin County for considerably less money than the horse was worth, because nobody wanted a horse that moved that slowly, and Jonas had recognized something in that which he did not put into words. Eli watched them go. The planter left its clean trail behind them, the soil folding back and settling, the seed dropping in its measured intervals. Jonas did not look up. He did not wave. He was watching the row and the horse and the set of the planter tongue with the kind of attention that has no audience in mind. Eli finished his cold coffee and went back to work. He had hired Jonas Yoder at the end of the previous planting season on the recommendation of Deacon Reuben, whose wife Sadie had been renting Jonas a room in her back addition since he'd come to Lancaster County from Mifflin. Reuben had said only that Jonas was a hard worker and an honest one, and that he had come from difficulty without letting the difficulty make him bitter, which Reuben seemed to consider the relevant information. Eli had agreed to take him on for the planting and the first cutting and see how it went. That had been 2 springs ago now. It had gone well enough that Eli stopped thinking of it as a trial arrangement, though neither of them had said so out loud. Jonas simply appeared each morning and did what needed doing, and Eli paid him at the end of each month in cash. And in the evenings, Jonas rode Pepper back down the road to Sadie Reuben's, and that was the arrangement. It was uncomplicated. Eli appreciated uncomplicated things more now than he once had. What he knew about Jonas Yoder's history, he had gathered slowly and without pressing. The Yoder family had farmed in Mifflin County for 2 generations, which was not as long as the Beilers had farmed in Lancaster, but was still something. Jonas's father, a man named Caleb, had borrowed against the farm in a bad year, and then borrowed again the following year, which had also been bad. And by the time Jonas was 16, the land was gone, and the family had scattered in the way that families scatter, when the thing that held them to a place is taken from them. An older brother went to work in an RV factory in Elkhart. A sister married into a community in Ohio. Caleb and his wife took up residence with relatives and grew, by all accounts, quieter each year. Jonas had come to Lancaster County with a horse, a set of tools, and the kind of self-possession that can only come from having already lost the thing you thought you couldn't survive losing. He was 23 years old. He had, as far as Eli could tell, no particular ambitions toward anything that could be measured in dollars or acres. What he had was patience and a careful pair of hands, and the gray-gelding Pepper, who moved down the south field rows that May morning, like a man who had come to a decision and was at peace with it. Eli did not think about any of this consciously, standing there at the field's edge with his empty cup. He simply watched and noted in the way that a farmer notes the sky or the soil, what was in front of him. He did not yet know what he was noting it for. The sound of the screen door brought him around. Hannah came across the yard with her head down against the morning light, carrying a mason jar of water in each hand. She was 21, and she had her mother's particular way of walking, purposeful and unhurried at the same time, like someone who had already decided where she was going and saw no reason to make a performance of getting there. She had been managing the Beiler household since Ruth passed, and she had done it without complaint and without asking for acknowledgement, and Eli was grateful to her in the deep, helpless way that parents are grateful for things their children do that they cannot adequately repay. She crossed the field toward Jonas without looking toward her father at the fence line. Jonas brought Pepper to a halt at the row's end and took the water jar she offered. He said something. She said something back. Neither of them smiled. They stood in the open light of the May morning with a polite distance between them, and the transaction took perhaps 45 seconds before Hannah turned and walked back across the field. Eli watched her go. Then he watched Jonas take a long drink, cap the jar, and set it on the planter seat. Then Jonas spoke to Pepper, low, and they turned into the next row and kept going. There was nothing in what Eli had just seen that he could have pointed to. There was nothing, if he was honest, that he had seen at all. Only two people behaving with perfect, ordinary decorum in a field on a May morning. He turned back toward the barn and thought about the south gutter drain that needed clearing before the next rain. He did not think about it again that day. At least he told himself he didn't. The last Sunday of May fell on an in-between week, which in an old order district means no church service and no formal visiting obligation. Though visiting happens anyway, because people are people. Levi came after the midday meal with Martha and their little one, a boy named Samuel, who had just learned to walk with the lurching, astonished confidence of someone who cannot believe this is working. They came in the buggy, and Samuel was deposited on the kitchen floor, where he immediately found the lowest cabinet and began pulling out Hannah's baking pans with great satisfaction. The afternoon was mild enough that the kitchen windows were open. Hannah had put up the first strawberry jam of the season that morning, and the jars were lined along the counter cooling, 12 of them, the lids sealed and turned down. They were old jars, Ruth's jars, the blue-tinted glass that Ball had stopped making in that particular shade some years back. Several had small chips at the rim, the kind that happen when a jar gets set down in a hurry or gets knocked against another in a canning box. Hannah kept them anyway. She had considered once or twice replacing them with newer ones, and each time had put the thought away without fully examining why. The jam was deep red in the old blue glass, and the kitchen smelled of it, warm and sweet in particular, the way that smell is always also something else, when the person who first taught you to make the thing is gone. Levi sat at the table with his father and drank coffee and talked about his corn ground, which he thought was looking good, and his spring pasture fence, which was not. Martha helped Hannah with the last of the cleanup without being asked. Samuel transferred his attention from the baking pans to Eli's boot, which he gripped with both hands and looked up at with an expression of complete triumph. Eli looked out the kitchen window. Jonas was at the south fence row. He had a fence rail balanced across the cedar post and was working the wire back into place with a pair of pliers, and he was doing it on a Sunday afternoon, his day off, without having mentioned it to anyone. Levi followed his father's gaze. "Yoder's out there," he said, not disapproving, just noticing. "Yeah," Eli said. "That section's been loose since the frost." Levi watched for a moment. "He doesn't take much time off." "No," Eli said. "He doesn't." Martha looked up from the dish towel in her hands and then looked at Hannah. And Hannah was looking at the jar she was lifting to the shelf, her back to the room, and Martha said nothing. "He from Mifflin County originally?" Levi asked. "His family was, yeah. Farm's gone now. He's been out here a couple years." Levi nodded slowly. It was not a nod that meant anything clear. It was the nod of a man filing information. "He boarding still with Sadie Rubin?" "Far as I know." There was a pause. Samuel had moved from Eli's boot to the leg of the table and was informing it of something at length. "He a good worker?" Levi asked. "I wouldn't have kept him on if he wasn't," Eli said, and his tone was gentle, but it closed the subject, the way a man closes a door quietly when he doesn't want a draft. Hannah set the last jar on the shelf. She did not turn around for a moment. Then she turned around and began folding the dish towels, and she said to Martha, "I thought I'd do a rhubarb cake this week. Samuel might like it." And the conversation shifted the way it needed to. Outside, Jonas worked the fence rail back into its post socket. He did not look toward the house. He crouched and checked the wire tension at the base of the post, stood, checked it again at the top, and moved to the next one. Eli watched until Martha said something to him about Samuel's latest vocabulary, which was developing opinions, and Eli turned back to the table and smiled, and the afternoon settled into itself, pleasant and ordinary, and faintly humming with things that had not been said. The hay came on in June the way it always does, sudden and urgent, the fields going from almost ready to "you'd better move" in what feels like a single afternoon. Eli had 2 cuttings to take off the home farm, and another field rented from a neighbor to the east, 40 acres that needed to come in before the weather broke. He brought Jonas on full-time for the duration and hired a neighbor boy to help with the loading, a 15-year-old named Daniel who worked hard and talked constantly about things he'd heard from his older brother, which was the most anyone could ask of a 15-year-old in haying season. The first cutting came in well. 4 days of hot work, the mower going and the tedder turning, and the baler laying down its rows of tight green bales. Pepper worked the rake with steady patience. Jonas drove him without hurry, without the small cruelties of impatience that some men apply to horses when the work is hot and long, a jerk of the line, a word that has an edge. He spoke to Pepper at the turns, low and even, and Pepper put his feet where they needed to go, and the rake passed over the field in its long, clean arcs. On the 3rd day of the first cutting, they were working the rented field, Eli running the baler and Jonas behind him with the wagon, Daniel on the wagon stacking. The afternoon had gotten warm, and the field smelled of cut grass and dust, and the particular green sweetness that is one of the fixed good things about June on a working farm. Eli was watching the baler's pickup head and thinking about the tension setting on the knotters when he heard the sound behind him change. He pulled up and looked back. The wagon team had shied. One of the neighbor's horses, a younger animal, had spooked at something in the hedgerow, a bird or a rustle, or nothing at all, the way young horses spook, and had jumped sideways hard enough to drag the wagon off the row and put the front wheel into the soft ground at the field edge. Daniel was on the wagon and had grabbed the sideboards with both hands. The horses were blowing and stamping, pulling against each other in the traces, not panicked, but not settled yet either. Jonas was down from the wagon seat before Eli had turned his tractor fully around. He went to the horses' heads, not hurrying, not grabbing, just appearing at the near horse's shoulder, the way you approach something frightened in the corner of its vision, steady and unalarming. He put his hand on the horse's neck and spoke to it. The horse stamped once more and then blew out and dropped its head a degree. Daniel, still gripping the sideboards, said something relieved and probably incoherent. The wagon wheel came out of the soft ground with some digging and some pushing, and no drama. The swath for that row was ragged, bales cut at an angle where the wagon had pulled wide. Jonas looked at it. He did not sigh. He did not say anything about the lost time or the uneven cut. He climbed back to the wagon seat, gathered the lines, spoke to the horses again, and kept working. Eli watched him settle the team back into the row and felt something shift in the way you feel a latch catch when you've been pressing on a door. He turned the baler around and let the thought go and drove on. At noon, they sat in the shade of the wagon with sandwiches that Hannah had sent along in a cloth-covered basket, ham and mustard on homemade bread, a jar of pickles, 3 pieces of choufle pie wrapped in wax paper. Daniel ate with the focused dedication of someone who had been burning calories since 5 in the morning. Jonas ate without haste, looking out over the half-cut field. Eli drank his water and thought about the knotters again, and then thought about Jonas at the horse's shoulder, and then thought about the knotters again. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The quiet between men who have been working together well all morning is its own kind of currency. And it was enough. Here is what I want to say to you, if you'll allow it. Jonas Yoder was not trying to prove something that day in the field. He was not performing steadiness for Eli's benefit, or for yours, or for anyone's. When the horse shied and the wagon went sideways, and a younger man might have cursed or yanked the lines or looked around to see who was watching, Jonas simply went to the horse's shoulder and did what the situation needed. He did it the same way he would have done it on a day when no one was there. That is, I think, perhaps the most reliable test of what is actually inside a person, not what they do in front of witnesses, but what they do when the audience is only themselves. If you've ever worked alongside someone like that, someone who just quietly did what needed doing, no fanfare, no grievance, no waiting to be thanked, you'll know exactly what Eli Beiler was starting to notice from the seat of that baler, even if he hadn't found the word for it yet. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from today. I always like to know who I'm talking to. The hay came in by the end of the week, and it was good hay, stored well, the barn breathing with it. Eli paid Jonas and said it was a good cutting, and Jonas said, "Yea, it was." And they both looked at the barn and nodded the way men nod at completed work, which is a particular kind of satisfaction. Jonas led Pepper out of the paddock and rode him home down the road in the long summer evening light, the gelding's gray coat warm and red with it. Eli watched them go from the barn door. Then he went inside and washed up and sat down at the kitchen table, where Hannah had left his supper keeping warm on the back of the stove, and he ate alone, which he was still not fully used to even after 3 years, and which he understood he would simply have to keep getting used to. August arrived the way August arrives in Lancaster County, which is heavily and without apology. The heat settled into the fields and the gardens and pressed itself flat against the farmyard in the middle of the day so that even the chickens moved slowly. The corn was high and promising. The kitchen garden had been productive beyond what one person needed, and so Hannah had called in the neighbor women for the canning, which was how it was done. Labor shared the way labor had always been shared in this community, moving from farm to farm with the season. On a Tuesday, they set up at the Beiler kitchen, Ada Stoltzfus from the next farm, and her daughter-in-law Lydia, and old Barbie Lapp who had been canning since before most of the others were born, and who had opinions about everything and expressed them freely. They were putting up tomatoes, green beans, and corn, and the kitchen was hot and alive with the sound of canning jars in their bath and women talking and the particular rhythm of that work, which is relentless and requires you to keep moving and rewards you at the end with the visible fact of what you have done lined up along the counter cooling. Hannah worked at the center of it, efficient and sure, and Ruth's blue jars filled row by row on the counter. The tomatoes went in deep red, the beans in their pale liquid, the corn in its golden rose. Some of the women used newer jars, clear glass, uniform, purchased from the hardware store in town. Hannah's blue ones sat among them, distinct and slightly mismatched, and she did not comment on this, and neither did anyone else. Jonas had been given work on the far side of the barn that week, repainting the lower boards where the weather had peeled them. He passed the kitchen once in the morning on his way to fill the paint bucket at the hydrant. Hannah did not look up from the stove. Barbie Lapp gave him a nod, and he nodded back and kept moving. He passed again in the afternoon. This time he slowed. The kitchen window was propped open with a stick against the heat, and through it the counter was visible, the rows of jars cooling in their sequence, the blue ones among the clear. Jonas stood at the hydrant with the empty bucket and looked at the window for a moment in the way a person looks when something has caught at them, and they are not sure why. He could not have known they were Ruth's jars. He hadn't been in this house when Ruth was alive. He did not know the story of those jars, or the shade of blue they were, or why they stayed on the shelf with their small rim chips, while newer ones sat in the pantry. He simply looked at them for a moment, the way a person sometimes stops in front of something they cannot explain. And then he filled his bucket and went back to the barn boards. Inside, Hannah had not looked up. She was lifting a jar from the canning pot with her tongs, careful and practiced, but she knew the moment he passed the window the second time. She knew the way you know things in a room when someone stops outside it, the way the air shifts slightly. She did not think about why she knew. She set the jar on the towel to cool and reached for the next one, and said something back to Barbie Lapp about whether you needed to adjust the processing time for the higher elevation on the Lapp farm, which Barbie had an opinion about, and the conversation carried on. What Hannah knew and what she thought about it, she kept in the same careful place where she had been keeping it since sometime the previous autumn. She examined it privately, the way you examine something fragile, turning it over slowly in good light, trying to see clearly what it actually was before you decided what to do with it. She was 21 years old, and she was not naive, and she was not impulsive, and she was, if she was honest with herself, frightened. Not of Jonas, of the clarity. It is one thing to wonder whether you feel something. It is another thing to look at it directly and know that you do. The second thing asks more of you, and Hannah Beiler was a person who, when she understood that something was asked of her, began quietly and without announcement to figure out how to answer. The jars cooled in their rows. Barbie Lapp declared the processing time a settled matter. Little Lydia fell asleep on the kitchen bench in the early afternoon, which everyone pretended not to notice. The day moved on. In October, the district held its council meeting. It came, as it always did, on the Saturday before the autumn communion and baptism Sunday, and Eli drove the buggy to the Zook farm, where the service was held in the large front room, cleared of furniture and set with backless benches in the way that all church was set up in this community, rotating from farm to farm across the district's homes, because the church was not a building, but a people, and a people needed no edifice but the willingness to meet. Bishop Amos stood at the front. He was a tall man, spare, with the kind of face that has been arranged by weather and responsibility into something weathered and specific. He had been bishop of this district for 11 years. He spoke without notes and without performance, which was the only way worth speaking. The council meeting had its form. Each baptized member of the district was asked in turn to affirm their standing before God and the community, It was not a confession of sins, though it could become one if a member had something unresolved that needed addressing before communion. It was a question of peace. Bist du noch im Frieden? Are you still at peace? With your neighbor, with the Ordnung, with God. The question was asked, and the members answered one by one. When Eli's turn came, he stood and said he was in peace, and he sat back down. He had answered this question many times in this room and in other rooms. He had meant it each time, or had worked to mean it, which is a different thing, but perhaps the more honest one. What stayed with him afterward, walking back to the buggy lot in the October afternoon, was not the service itself, but what his mind had done during it, which was to bring up Jonas Yoder, unprompted, when the room was quiet. He had not been thinking about the hired man. He had been sitting in the stillness that comes after the question has been asked and answered, and the room rests in its communal breath. And his mind had gone, quietly and without permission, to the south field in May, and the hay field in June, and the August kitchen window, and then to Jonas at the fence row on that off Sunday afternoon, working without an audience, and then, carefully, to Hannah lifting a jar from the canning pot without looking up. He sat with it. He gave it the space that stillness gives things. By the time the service moved into its closing prayer, Eli had not reached a conclusion, but he understood that something had been growing in his awareness long enough that it had begun to feel less like surprise and more like a thing he had simply not yet spoken. He was a man who took his time, always had been. Ruth used to say he was the most patient man she'd ever known, and then she would add, quietly, that it occasionally made her want to scream, and she would smile when she said it. He missed her at the most unexpected moments, and this was one of them. He drove home in the cool October evening. The fields were going amber, and the woodlot at the south end of his property had gone red in the maples. The corn stood dry and ready for harvest. Everything was where it was supposed to be, seasonally speaking, and the sight of it was both a comfort and a sharpening, because harvest season had a weight to it, a sense of account of what the year had added up to. He brought the buggy into the barn and unhitched and brushed down the mare. Pepper was in the next stall, Jonas having left him for the night, and the gray gelding turned his big head and regarded Eli with the calm, incurious benevolence that is Pepper's characteristic expression, as though he has already thought about whatever you might bring to him and found it manageable. Eli stood in the barn with the two horses and thought about what it means to be a man of good standing. He thought about whether standing had to do with what you owned or what you were. He knew what the Ordnung would say. He knew what the bishop would say. He was less certain, standing there, what he himself had been saying in his private heart, without realizing it. He didn't answer himself. He turned off the lantern and went inside. Hannah had left his supper keeping warm. He sat down and ate, and the house was quiet, and the October dark came down over the fields, and somewhere down the road at Sadie Rubin's place, Jonas Yoder was at the end of his own day. Whatever Eli had been carrying since that council meeting morning, it sat with him quietly through the corn harvest and into the shortening days. He let it sit. He did not push it toward a conclusion, because pushing things toward conclusions before they were ready was not how he operated, and had not been since he was young enough to think that speed was the same thing as decisiveness. What he was not quite expecting, on a mid-October afternoon when he was at the south fence row with a new rail and a hammer, was for the question to come from the other direction. He heard the footsteps before he heard the voice. He knew the footsteps. You get to know how a person moves across a farmyard after 2 seasons of working beside them. He kept setting the rail. Eli. Jonas stopped a few feet away. He had his hands at his sides. He was not wearing his hat. He had taken it off before he spoke, which was either nervousness or respect or both. Eli set the fence rail against the post and straightened up and looked at him. Jonas met his eyes. He said, "I'd like to ask you something, and I want to ask it plain." Eli said, "All right. I'd like your permission to come calling on Hannah. I know I haven't got much. I'm not pretending otherwise. I know what I have and I know what I don't have. But I wanted to ask you honest, face to face, and let you say what you think." The field was quiet. A crow called from somewhere in the woodlot. The afternoon sun came in low and flat across the amber corn rows and threw long shadows along the fence line. Eli said nothing for what felt to Jonas like a very long time. What happened in Eli's silence was not calculation. It was not cold appraisal of assets. It was something closer to the feeling he'd had in the council meeting room, that sense of a thing rising to the surface that had been there long enough it should not have been a surprise. And yet, he said, "What do you have?" Jonas did not flinch. "Pepper. My tools. Enough saved to rent ground. Maybe next spring if I can find what's available in the district. No land of my own. No family nearby. I know it." Eli said, "And what do you intend?" Jonas was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was even and careful. "To court her properly if she'll have it. To build something if I can. To be honest with her and with you and not promise more than I'm sure of." Eli looked at him. He looked at him the way a man looks at a fence post he is deciding whether to pull or reinforce, checking for what is below the surface. He said, "I need time to think on it." Jonas held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. He reached down and picked up the fence rail that Eli had set against the post and fitted it back into the slot, checking it with his hands for level, and then moved along the fence line and found the next section that needed attention. Eli watched him. He picked up his own hammer and held it and stood there in the long October light for a moment that he would not quite forget. "He needs time to think on it," he had said. He walked back to the barn, alone with the hammer in his hand and the fence row behind him and Jonas Yoder still working in the last of the light. And the question that Eli Beiler had not yet answered stayed with him like the smell of the cut fields, present in particular, and not going anywhere on its own. The week after Jonas came to the fence row, Eli went about his work the way he always did, which is to say steadily and without visible disturbance. But something in him had shifted the way a stone shifts in a creek bed when the current changes. Nothing dramatic, just a new position, and everything flowing around it differently than before. He did not speak to Hannah about it. He was not ready, and he knew that not being ready was not the same as being unwilling, and he allowed himself that distinction. He watched her in the kitchen in the mornings, moving between the stove and the table with her mother's quiet efficiency, and he thought about what she knew and what she felt, and whether those were the same thing. And he understood that these were questions he could not answer by watching her across a kitchen. He would need to ask her, and he would. But there was an order to things. He thought about Jonas at the fence row. He kept working. The image sat in Eli's mind with a patience that matched its subject. He thought about Caleb Yoder, a man he had never met, who had borrowed against his land in a bad year, and then another, and had lost it. He thought about the difference between a man who loses everything and breaks under it, and a man who loses everything and shows up the following spring in a stranger's field, ready to work. He thought about which of those a man could choose to be, and which of those Jonas had chosen. He thought about the gray gelding pepper, purchased at auction for less than his worth, because nobody wanted a horse that moved carefully. He thought about Ruth. Ruth had been 20 when Eli asked her father for permission to come calling. Eli had been 22, farming rented ground with his brother, no land of his own, nothing to offer but intention and a willingness to work that he could not prove in advance, only demonstrate over time. Her father, a man named Daniel Glick, had said yes, not without hesitation, but yes. Eli had not thought about Daniel Glick in years. He thought about him now. He went to find Hannah on a Thursday evening after supper when she was in the garden pulling the last of the season's dried bean plants from the stakes. The sun was going and the air had the cold edge that October evenings carry in Lancaster County, the smell of leaf mold and turned earth, and the particular stillness that falls over a farm at the end of the working day. He told her that Jonas had spoken to him. Hannah pulled a bean plant from its stake and shook the dirt from the roots. She did not look up immediately. "I know," she said. Eli waited. She looked up then. Her face was composed, which he recognized as different from being unmoved. She said, "I'm not going to tell you what to decide, Dade. That's not how it works, and I wouldn't want it to. But I'll tell you what's true, if you want to hear it." He said he did. She said, "He's a good man. I've watched him for 2 years, and I know what I've seen." She paused. "Now, I'm not saying that's everything. I know it isn't. But it isn't nothing either." Eli looked at his daughter for a long moment. She looked back at him, steady and undefended, which took a kind of courage he recognized and was glad to see. He said, "I know it isn't nothing." He went inside. Hannah went back to the bean plants. The garden settled into the early dark, and neither of them had said yes, and neither of them had said no, and both of them understood that the thing was still moving, and that it would arrive somewhere, and that patience was not the same as indifference. It was, in fact, sometimes the most demanding thing you could ask of a person. What Eli had not accounted for was Martha. Not Martha herself exactly. Martha was a good woman, and a fair one, and she had never, to Eli's knowledge, done a careless thing with information in her life. But she had a sister, and her sister had a neighbor, and communities like this one are not small in their acreage, but they are small in the number of degrees that separate any two pieces of information from the ears they were not meant for. Levi arrived on a Sunday evening in the first week of November without Martha and without Samuel, which told Eli something before Levi had said a word. He came in and sat at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee Hannah poured him, and Hannah, reading the room with the accuracy she had inherited from her mother, said she had something to do in the back of the house, and left them. Levi put both hands around the cup. He was a solid man, broad through the shoulders with Eli's coloring and Ruth's mouth. He was a good farmer and a devoted husband, and a man who loved his sister genuinely, which is important to understand. Because what he said next came from that love, even if the love had gotten tangled up with something else along the way. He said, "Is it true that Yoder asked you about Hannah?" Eli said it was true. Levi was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And you're thinking about it?" "I am." "Dad." Levi set down the cup. "He's got nothing. He boards with Sadie Rubin. He owns a horse. He came here from Mifflin County because his family lost everything and he's been a hired man for 2 years, and I don't see what's changed about that." Eli said, "He's been a good hired man. I'm not saying he's a bad person." "What are you saying?" Levi looked at him. "I'm saying Hannah deserves to be provided for. She's been running this house since Mam died, and she's done it without complaining, and she's given up things a girl her age should have had. And when she marries, I want her to marry someone who can give her something real, something solid. Not someone who's starting from less than nothing because his family couldn't hold on to what they had." The kitchen was quiet. The lantern on the table threw its warm circle, and outside the window the November evening was fully dark. Eli looked at his son. He looked at him carefully, the way he had looked at Jonas at the fence row, checking for what was below the surface. He said, "What his family did or didn't hold on to isn't Jonas's account. I know that, but it speaks to something. Does it?" "A man without roots," Levi said, and he said it not unkindly but with a firmness that had conviction in it. "A man without land, without family near, without standing in this district. Hannah would be starting from nothing with him, and if something went wrong, there'd be nothing to fall back on." Eli said, "There's him." Levi shook his head, frustrated. "That's not enough, Dade. That's not enough for her." Eli sat with that for a moment. He could feel the edges of the argument he might make. He chose not to make it. Not yet. Not tonight. Not like this, because Levi had not arrived at this place from nowhere, and correcting a man in the heat of his conviction rarely does what you hope it will. He said, "I'm still thinking on it, Levi. That's all I can tell you tonight." Levi looked like he wanted to say more. He didn't. He picked up his cup and drank the rest of his coffee and set it down and looked at the table. "I just want her to be all right," he said, and his voice, when he said it, had gone quieter, and what was in it was not argument, but something rawer than that. "I know," Eli said. "So do I." Levi left without seeing Hannah, which was unusual. She came back into the kitchen after the buggy had gone down the lane, and she looked at her father and he looked at her. And she said, "Was it about Jonas?" He said it was. She nodded once. She began washing Levi's cup at the sink and did not say anything else that evening. But Eli saw in the set of her shoulders and the particular way she moved that she had heard more than she was letting on, and that it had cost her something, and that she was absorbing the cost without complaint, which she had learned from her mother, and which made him both proud of her and sorry. He went to bed that night carrying more than he had started the day with. Now, here is where I want to stop for just a moment, outside the kitchen and outside the November evening, and say something that I think matters. Levi Beiler was not wrong to want his sister protected. He was not wrong to be afraid for her. What he was, and what most of us have been at one time or another, was a man who had absorbed a way of measuring without knowing he'd absorbed it. He had grown up in a community that preached plainly and consistently that wealth is not virtue and pride is sin. And he believed that he would have said so without hesitation if you'd asked him. And he also, somewhere below the place where he could easily see it, had a picture of what a proper husband looked like that had more to do with acreage and standing than he would have recognized if you'd held it up to him directly. That is not a failing that belongs only to Eli Beiler. It is a human thing, the way a belief we were taught can coexist without our noticing, with a feeling that contradicts it. The hard thing is not admitting a wrong once you can see it. The hard thing is finding it in yourself when it is comfortable and familiar and wearing the face of reasonable concern. Levi would find it, but it would take one more morning. He came back on a Sunday, an in-between week, the second to last Sunday in November. He came alone, early before the day had fully decided what it was going to be. The sky was low and gray, and the fields were bare, the corn stubble pale in the thin light, the woodlot stripped of its color and standing in its winter architecture of branch and trunk. Eli was at the south fence row when he heard the buggy in the lane. He had been there since first light, not because the fence particularly demanded it, though the frost heave had loosened 2 more posts, but because the south fence row was where he went when he had things to work through, and he had things to work through. He had his bar and his tamping tool, and he was working the first post back into solid ground when Levi came across the field toward him, his breath making small clouds in the November air. Eli did not stop working. He tamped the post and checked it and moved to the next one. Levi stopped a few feet away. He did not say anything immediately. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked out over the bare field for a moment, and something in his posture was different from the Sunday evening in the kitchen. The conviction had gone quieter. There was something else in its place. "I've been thinking," Levi said. Eli tamped the post. "Yeah." "About what I said. About Yoder." He paused. "About what I meant when I said he had nothing." Eli set the tamping bar down and straightened and looked at his son. Levi's jaw worked for a moment. He looked like a man trying to find the right door into a room he wasn't sure he wanted to enter. "When I married Martha," he said, "I had 40 acres I was renting from her uncle. That's what I had. And her father still said yes, because Martha wanted it, and because he trusted that I was serious and that I would work." He stopped. "I've been sitting with that all week." Eli waited. "And I've been thinking about why that felt different to me. Why I was so sure it was different." He shook his head slowly. "I keep coming back to the same thing, and I don't like what it is." "Tell me what it is," Eli said. Levi looked at him. "It felt different because I knew people here. Because my family's name meant something in this district. Because I had roots and Yoder doesn't. And I told myself that was the practical difference, the thing that made it a different situation. But it isn't practical, is it?" It was not quite a question. It's just that I knew the shape of me, and I didn't know the shape of him. The November air moved over the bare field. A crow called from the woodlot, 2 notes, and went quiet. Eli picked up the tamping bar and held it loosely in his hands and looked out at the fence line that ran to the edge of his property and then beyond it to the neighbor's trees. He said, "You know what Jonas did the day he asked me?" Levi waited. "I told him I needed time. I didn't give him an answer. I gave him nothing. And he stood there and he didn't argue and he didn't plead and he didn't ask me why. He picked up a fence rail and put it back in its slot and kept working." Eli paused. "He worked that fence row for another hour after I left. I watched from the barn. He didn't know I was watching." Levi was quiet. "That's not a man with nothing," Eli said. "That's a man with something you can't put in a ledger." Levi looked at the fence row. He looked at it for a long time. The weathered cedar posts and the rail Jonas had fitted back into its slot on that October afternoon, which was still sitting plumb and solid, done right. When he looked back at his father, something in his face had changed in the way that faces change when a person has put something down that they did not realize they had been holding. "I was wrong," he said, "about the way I was thinking about it." Eli looked at his son steadily. "You were afraid for her," he said. "That's not wrong." "The afraid part wasn't wrong," Levi said. "The rest of it was." They stood in the cold morning air, father and son, at the fence row that was always partially in need of repair and always being repaired, and neither of them said anything more for a moment, and it was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was the particular sufficiency of 2 people who have found their way back to the same ground. Levi helped Eli work the second post before he left. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Levi drove his buggy back down the lane a little before 9, and Eli watched him go and then turned back to the fence and finished what he'd started. He found Jonas the following Saturday at the barn before the morning had properly begun. He had decided, sometime in the gray early hours while he lay in the quiet of his bedroom listening to the farm settle around him, that there was no point in waiting any longer, not because he was being pushed toward something, but because he had been given everything he needed to decide, and continuing to wait would not give him more. It would only give him more waiting. And Eli Beiler had always known the difference between patience and delay. Jonas was at the barn door when Eli came out of the house in the thin November light. He was fitting a new pin into one of the sliding door's lower hinges, crouched at the base of the door with a small hammer, doing it precisely, checking the fit with his thumb. Pepper was visible in the paddock beyond, standing in the cold with his head slightly lowered, his gray coat making him part of the pewter-colored morning. Eli walked across the yard and stopped a few feet from Jonas. Jonas looked up. He read something in Eli's face because he was a man who had learned to read things carefully, and he set the hammer down on the barn floor and stood up and waited. Eli said, "I've thought about what you asked me." Jonas held his eyes. He said nothing. "You asked me plain, so I'll answer you plain." Eli put his hands in his coat pockets. "You haven't got much, that's true, and you said it yourself, and I respect that you said it. But I've been watching you work for 2 seasons, and I know what I've seen. And a man who does right when nobody's watching is a man who does right. That's not nothing. That's not close to nothing." The cold morning air was still. In the paddock, Pepper shifted his weight and blew out a slow breath that showed white. Eli said, "You have my permission. Whatever happens from here is between you and Hannah, and I'll stay out of it the way I'm meant to. But you have my word, and you have my blessing, and that's what you asked for." Jonas stood there in the barn doorway in the November light, and something moved through his face. Not a smile, not quite. Something quieter than that and deeper. He said, "Thank you, Eli." He said it with the simplicity of a man who does not have a larger speech prepared, who meant only exactly what he said. Eli nodded, and Jonas reached down and picked up the small hammer from the barn floor and turned back to the hinge pin. He fitted it carefully, checked the alignment, tapped it into place with 2 clean strokes, and tested the door's movement with his free hand. Then he moved to the next hinge and kept working. Eli stood at the barn door and watched him for a moment. Pepper raised his broad gray head in the paddock and regarded both of them with his characteristic, unhurried calm. The November sky had lightened to a pale, even silver above the bare fields, and the farm lay around them in its winter plainness, beautiful in the way that plain things are beautiful, when you are standing still enough to see them. He kept working. That was all. He simply kept working. And Eli, standing there in the cold morning with his hands in his coat pockets and the question finally answered, understood that this was not incidental. It was not a habit or an accident or a lack of feeling. It was, as plainly and as fully as anything a man could say with words, exactly who Jonas Yoder was. A man who picked up what needed doing and did it, and did not wait to be seen doing it, and did not put it down when things were uncertain, and would not put it down when things were not. There are men who measure a man by what he owns, and there are men who measure a man by what he does when no one is watching. Eli Beiler had spent 52 years learning the difference, and he had come close in these past weeks to forgetting it, or at least to letting other voices remember it louder than his own. He was grateful, quietly and without decoration, that he had found his way back. He was grateful for a son who had found his way back too, in his own time, at his own fence row. He was grateful for a daughter who had looked at him steadily in the garden and told him what was true, and then stepped back and let him be the one to decide. Because she understood, as Ruth had understood, that there are some things a person has to arrive at on their own. He was grateful, more than anything, that when Jonas Yoder had stood at the fence in October with his hat in his hands and said, I know what I have, and I know what I don't have. He'd been telling the complete truth. Because a man who knows exactly what he has and says so without shame, and then picks up a fence rail and keeps working, is not a man who has nothing. He is, in fact, precisely the kind of man a daughter needs. Eli turned from the barn door and walked back across the yard toward the house. The cold air was clean on his face. Somewhere in the woodlot, the crows were starting up their morning argument. The farm was waking around him, steady and unhurried, the way it always did, the way it would keep doing, season following season in their faithful order. He went inside. The kitchen was warm. Hannah was at the stove, and she turned when he came in, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and he gave her one slow nod. She turned back to the stove, but he saw her shoulders drop, just slightly, the way a person's shoulders drop when they have been holding something they didn't know they were holding, and he understood that she would go through the rest of that morning with the particular quiet that comes not from emptiness but from relief, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was all of it. If this story stayed with you, there are more like it waiting. Subscribe, and I'll see you next time.